Good evening, I shouldn't say. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy that you made it here, although the weather is very nice today. But I think we have a very good reason to be here. I'm absolutely pleased and feel very honored to welcome our distinguished guest professor, Professor Amina Mama, as the third Angela Davis Professor of the Cornelia Goethe Center. For those of you for whom this is the first encounter with the Cornelia Goethe Center for Women and Gender Studies, I just have a short summary. What we are doing, the CGC, as we say, is an interdisciplinary research institute named after the very gifted sister of Johann Wolfgang, who unfortunately died at a very young age. Our center promotes cooperation between researchers from various disciplines, and we have members from nine faculties of this university among our center members. What we do is focus on the historical and cultural construction of gender, and we do this by considering the epistemological critique of gender to be the foundation of our analytical work. Our approach to feminist analysis uses insights from the tradition of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which we continue but also expand and challenge. Thereby, in our work, what we do is addressing ambivalences, paradoxes, contradictions, ruptures, and dilemmas of gender relation in our research and our teaching. In December 2013, we established the Chair for International Gender and Diversity Studies in the name of Angela Davis. Why Angela Davis? Because she is a former student of our university. She was in Frankfurt from during the years 1965 to 1967. At that time, Angela Davis participated in the then burgeoning student movement, which has been a theme of this whole year, the 68. So she was like in the very beginning of the 68, she was here. And she was a PhD student of Horkheimer and Adorno. Angela Davis, in 2013, Angela Davis herself inaugurated the chair, and in 2015, the second holder, Professor Chandra Mohanty from Syracuse University, spoke about violence, neoliberalism from a post-colonial perspective. And you will actually see when Uta Ruppert in a moment introduces Professor Amina Mama that we have been able to find these three personalities somehow in debate with each other, and they take up themes from each other's work. And I'm really extremely happy that you accepted our invitation. But before I hand over very shortly to my colleague Uta Ruppert, she will introduce Amina Mama to you. I wish to thank a couple of institutions and a couple of people. Without the Equal Opportunities Office of the Cornelia Goethe of the Goethe University, and also that would be right. I mean, we can ask for a name change, maybe. Okay, so the Equal Opportunities Office, we are very grateful to them, and we are enormously grateful to the Friends of the Cornelia Goethe Center, for their continuous financial support. We couldn't do this without you and your support for this guest professorship. Also, the Freunde und Förderer of the Goethe University have been enabling us to organize this event. I was asked also to tell you that we are filming this event, so all of you are taken from the back. So just you know that that this is happening. If any of you has some kind of problem with that, just come up and tell us. Okay. So without much further ado, I hand over to Ute Ruppert, who will introduce Amina Mama to you.
Yeah, a very warm welcome to everybody also from my side. As Helma said, my name is Ute Ruppert. I'm a political and social scientist at the Goethe University's Social Science faculty. My chair is for Development, Global South and Gender Studies, and since my first semester here in Frankfurt, I'm a member of the Cornelia Goethe Center's Board of Directors. All this together brought me to this very special moment in my academic career to serve as this year's Angela Davis Chair academic host. It is my major honor, I want to say, and a great, great pleasure. And I am as proud as a little bit nervous to introduce to you Professor Amina Mama. As all our Angela Davis guest chairs, Professor Mama is a worldwide renowned scholar whose work has tremendous impact on transnational feminist theory, on feminist epistemological thinking and methodology, and has been so essential in informing our understandings of feminisms in Africa. What she also shares with her precursors here in Frankfurt, and what might be in our times of right-wing pressures, not only on feminist and gender studies, but on the fundamentals of democracy as such, even more precious than ever before, is her strong insistence in the very basic feminist idea and concept of reconcilement of radical feminist thinking and feminist practices. In the very best Gramscian sense, I would say, Amina Mama is a Nigerian-British feminist intellectual who has worked for over 2 decades in Europe, in a variety of African countries, as well as in the US, in research, in teaching, as well as in feminist organizing, in building pan-African and transnational networks, and last not least, in advising and sometimes also changing international political institutions. By training, Amina Mama is a psychologist who studied at St. Andrews in Scotland and at the London School of Economics. Her PhD, which she got in 1987 from the University of London, is also in social psychology, with a thesis on subjectivities of Black women that developed an intersectional approach long before this epistemic perspective became internationally as prominent as it is today. Black women's subjectivities and the deconstruction of imperial psychology is also the subject of Beyond the Masks, that of her books, which is probably internationally most famous. After a period of teaching at European universities, Amina Mama accepted in 1999 a call to the University of Cape Town. Rather shortly after the end of apartheid, in one of the whitest academic places in South Africa, she founded the African Gender Institute, which she led as its director over a whole decade. Until today, the African Gender Institute is, as I would say, the most important platform on the continent for the collaborative development and establishment of feminist studies and research. And so is the extraordinary open access gender studies journal Feminist Africa, without any doubt the richest source on feminisms in theory and practices in Africa, whose founding editor she was in 2001 and whose acting director she still is today. After 10 years of leading the center and the journal, of writing numerous books and articles, most of them focusing on the interconnections between militarism, colonialism, and state feminisms, of teaching at UCT and voluntary teaching in many different countries and places in Africa, Amina Mama accepted a position at Mills College in Oakland, California, and immediately after became the first Barbara Lee Distinguished Chair in Women's Leadership at Mills. Currently, she's chair of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of California, Davis. I'm not 100% sure, but I think she was already at Davis when she, as the pathbreaker and feminist cross-border commuter she obviously is, started to produce in collaboration with the Ghanaian filmmaker Yaba Bado 2 documentary films, The Witches of Gambaga, which appeared in 2011, and The Art of Ama-Ata Aidu, which appeared in 2014. And it is my immense pleasure to announce today publicly that we will show the Witches film next Thursday at 6 p.m. on our campus in the neighbor building, the PEG building. You will find all information you need on the CGC website. The inauguration lecture Amina Mama is going to present tonight carries the title Africa Unpacified, as you know, from freedom fighters to feminists. It will discuss the perils of patronage in post-colonial Africa and explore how continental feminism has worked to demystify and subvert the performances of gender and sexual politics in the across-serial authoritarian regimes. Corresponding to what I've already said about Amina's involvements in transnational as well as pan-African feminisms, a focus will lie on how continental and transnational networks have facilitated the emergence of more radical feminism that contests the politics of patronage, recuperating pan-Africanism as radical strategy in the process. Dear Amina, it is such a great honor to repeat it again and a pleasure to have you here. And before I pass the floor over to her, please join me in giving her the most cordial welcome.
You're a great promoter. Wow, thank you. These introductions are quite, a great honor. They're also a little destabilizing. But thank you for honoring me with what I would describe more as a tribute. Now I have to live up to it. But I really do want to thank my hosts. They've treated me with incredible kindness and generosity since I got here the day before yesterday. And it's, I'm used to working some tough territory, so I'm a bit sentimental when I'm treated really nicely. I've been a bit overwhelmed, and it's a great pleasure to be here in you're smiling, you look friendly and welcoming. So that is a special pleasure, and I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank my predecessors and convey to you, I actually got a call from Angela Davis the day before I left. I had one-day transit in the Bay Area and then came, and she had come from Berlin, so we sort of passed, and she called really to extend her greetings to all of the people here and to thank them and to thank me. And I thanked her, and that was about the essence of the conversation, because she's someone I've admired since I was maybe 9 years old when I watched her walk out of jail. I was watching TV in Nigeria at the time, growing up, and I never forgot that image. It compares with the image of Mandela walking out of jail in my mindset. Okay, so how long do you want? I'll give you... Yeah. Okay. Well, you're all here, captive. I shall begin. Uta's done a very, very good introduction to what I hope to cover. It was a little ambitious, so I will shorten a bit as I go along. But let's start with the very basic thing. How do we define feminism? This is a lot more complicated than it might have been. Back in the 1700s, when that French feminist Olympe de Gouges was executed for her insistence on the rights of women. These days, the term has evolved and changed and diversified, and it's a little disturbing. I'm an old school, in a sense, getting on, nearly 60. The term has evolved and changed, and nowadays, all kinds of people claiming feminism. This is a good and a bad thing, but I will have to clarify that I will not be talking about certain manifestations and claims. I'm an epistemological purist, so I'm very happy that Beyonce and Emma Watson are declaring popular feminism. You know, it says we've had some kind of an impact. I'm a little disturbed by some of the things, so you can see what I'm saying. So I'm going to actually return to the roots of feminism, partly because I'm especially interested in the roots of feminism in Africa. And that means that I am working with left feminism. Because for me, the originary roots of modern feminism lie in the early writings of communist women, the socialist movements, the early feminists in the Pan-African movement, and the anti-imperialist struggles. So those are our roots. It's a different trajectory from the Western history of feminism. And from very early on, presumably because I was raised in Nigeria, I never believed that feminism was invented by Europe and sent to Africa as a sort of pre-designed package. There is no doubt that European women have had a presence in Africa, mostly in support of colonial regimes, and indeed founded some of the liberal women's organizations. Those are not really what I'm talking about. Colonial feminism, has mixed results, and it's been taken up in various ways. But in short, the primary agenda, and I think it's helpful to situate one's understanding of feminism in a primary political agenda. But as we know, throughout the colonial era, the era of the great European empires, feminism or women's involvement, let's say, European women's involvement was about the big project, which was maintaining pacification. Okay, it was in colonial pacification, perhaps not as harsh as military killings and brutal physical conquest, but nonetheless, perhaps even tempering that, but nonetheless, the big picture was pacification. And of course, many Africans were also recruited into pacification. My position on colonialism may be helpful in situating the rest of my remarks. But basically, I've been rereading and reteaching colonialism again this year. And the more I look at it, the more I understand how, although women are often accused of complicity with Europeans, particularly in relation to feminism, actually, if you look properly at empire and imperialism, it was an entirely male-focused, I would say phallocentric project. Go out, conquer, subjugate. It's a very macho impulse. So apart from its epistemological androcentrism and its militarism, it also, when it got to the colonies, the kind of gender ideology that the Europeans brought to places like Africa were very patriarchal. So actually they recruited and conscripted hundreds of thousands of African men. Depending where you look on the continent, there's variation, but by and large, colonialism was about the exclusion and marginalization of women from the public arena and installing them in private households in complete ignorance of the fact that they were doing so much of the economic productive work that was never going to fly for most women, maybe a tiny minority, and maybe in among the Islamic elites, some women could manage the luxury, attain the luxury of not having to labor. But let's not be distracted by that. The reality for the vast majority of women has been labor under increasingly arduous conditions. Colonialism made work for women much harder by removing men, recruiting them to the mines, conscripting them to fight in the great wars that rummaged this continent in the 20th century. So the masculinity of the imperial project should not be in any doubt. And that is the overarching frame of empire. And it has many implications for the conditions I'm going to spend most of my time talking about, which is the post-colonial conditions of Africa. Because if in some cultures we had systems that were dual sex, there were parallel structures in some of our cultures, what colonialism did was only work with the male aspect of the political and leave aside whatever. They just didn't see it, didn't accept it, ignored it. So even if you go to Ashanti now, you'll find that the male structure has been incorporated into the modern post-colonial state, but the female structure, the women's courts, have not. Yet they still exist, which gives them a certain organic legitimacy. They've persisted despite being completely excluded from the modern administrative and political systems that still really, were laid down during colonialism and have not yet been radically transformed. So colonialism masculinized the entire continent that I'm focusing on in very, very particular ways. And the sooner we as Africans come to terms with that, the sooner we'll be able to stop claiming atavistic colonial laws as African tradition. There are lots of examples in previous work, on wife-beating, male members of parliament refusing to outlaw wife-beating because they claim it's a tradition. Africans didn't have such traditions. It was the British rule of thumb entitling a man to beat his wife with a stick no wider than his thumb. So this kind of residue keeps being appropriated by patriarchs concerned to declare feminism in Africa as Western, imperialist, and imposed. So I'm making a very clear distinction here. Again, I want to focus on considering post-colonial African feminism and the conditions under which that has emerged and emerged to become a significant political force in the three countries I'm talking about, despite their dictatorial history, as well as in international arenas. So I'm going to focus on developing with you, I hope we'll have some discussion, a critical, and I mean radical. I mean, we talk critical theory, but my understanding of the term is that it means radical, get to the root of things and don't accept unquestioningly. Radical feminist analysis that draws, so I'm going to develop this concept, this approach, drawing on the intellectual traditions I've briefly mentioned, the anti-imperialist intellectual tradition, the Pan-African, certain aspects of the Pan-African tradition, and the international socialist feminist movements. So these are three movements that have also generated intellectual traditions that are good to work with in terms of contemporary Africa, which is my current focus. Left feminism, as I said, was forged in socialist and other movements, and specifically in Africa. Left feminism took deep root during the mid-20th century liberation movements. This is not to say there were not mass mobilizations of women and many indigenous forms of feminism before that, but the takeoff point for contemporary feminism I'm locating in the feminist-led mobilizations that began during the recent historical period In other words, since the end of colonialism. There's great history as a result of feminist interventions in the field of gender and colonialism. There's a substantial body of literature. But as an activist, it concerns all of us, I think, that what we really need is not that wonderful, beautiful history, most of which is produced by European and American scholars because there's not much funding for historical research in Africa by Africans. That work has a contribution. Some of it is excellent, some of it less so. But what movements need is current knowledge on the last 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. That is what activists need if they're to critically reflect and adjust their strategies. Now, some of this goes on on an ongoing basis, but we do suffer from poor archiving and a lack of continuity, so that the most recent turns out to be extremely hard to research. I spent a good year looking for archives and things, and just on the modern period, the recent period, and that was actually very challenging, and it demands a massive feminist archiving project with immediate, the sooner the better, because every day people are dying and we're losing the history of even my generation right now as I speak. So this is the motivation. That plus finding myself in the US, that's the furthest I've ever been from the continent. I mean, here at least I'm halfway home. So I think that severe nostalgia, be direct, severe homesickness, nostalgia, and a fear of my own alienation and neutralization has also driven this work. So I do see research and indeed the classroom as activist opportunities. What we have to work with, given the nature of the neoliberal university, of course, is harder than it may have been when there was free education at some point in the past. But both pedagogy, the methods through which you teach, and epistemology and its translation into methodologies, I do think offer subversive opportunities, and that is why many of us are still in universities, not to mention the millions of young Africans in universities at the moment. So if we can't be with them, then we will write for them. And as you know, I do editing to try and develop much more writing. Okay, so throughout the period I'm talking about, Africa is a region of just one of many regions of post-colonial feminisms that have emerged with the end of direct colonial rule, the transition into what I call flag independence. Feminism has proliferated across all the former colonies, in virtually every country, developed, underdeveloped, north, south. As movements have discovered and articulated gender politics, pursuing freedom for the oppressed majorities under a whole variety of conditions. I'm only going to talk about 3 countries, but because I'm in Europe, I will mention that both the UN and the African Union recognize 54 nations. Africa is not what Bill Clinton once described as a country. There is now a cynical blog, Africa is a country, for those who want to be entertained. And then the different colonialisms, English, German, French, Portuguese, Spanish, they've all left, essentially. The people and the armies and the bureaucrats have all left. The residues are nonetheless there. So there's huge diversity. The 3 I'm talking about are the ones I've spent the most time engaging with the women's movements and feel most comfortable with, because I am not studying my own country, which is an epistemological issue we could talk about. That's why I'm using a Pan-African frame, but I'm going to focus on Ghana in West Africa, Uganda in East Africa, and Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. The 3 are selected, not because they're the only dictatorial regimes that women have survived and struggled with, but because all of them have a history of making strong claims of revolutionary politics, which has complicated the terrain for feminist struggles. So they're very tricky places. And I don't know with the time we have how well I can detail the kinds of tricks. It'd probably be at the first level, but there are many levels beneath in detail, which we won't have time to explore. But let me sketch it out. So that means I'm leaving out 51 nations, many of which have not been researched. So there's plenty of work. Let's form a transnational community that's going to pick up on some of the least researched countries and support local researchers. So my approach would be described as transnational, 3 countries, deliberately from one region, one continent. It's definitely intersectional, to use today's terminology. But these terms, they tend to be presented as new discoveries, especially in the US. And in the US, it's being jargonized and jingoized, and everybody's talking intersectionality these days in ways that are problematic. They very often erase the epistemological roots of the idea that is now called intersectionality in socialist feminist movements that were, of course, intersectional around class and gender. That's been going for a long time. Not to mention the interventions of black feminists in the West, from Angela Davis in 1982 to the black British feminists to the Afro-German feminists. So, to my mind, these ideas are not new, and we can trace a longer ancestry back to the early 20th century in the writings of women like Claudia Jones, the black communist feminist who was detained and deported from the USA. And there were black radical feminists who tried very hard, just prior to McCarthyism, to link with the South African early members of the ANC in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Pretty much all of that was wiped out by anti-communism in the US, which has been particularly virulent in purging the black communist organizations like the Sojourners for Truth and Freedom. Short-lived, but historically and epistemologically very, very important in the sense that they clearly articulated the politics of class, race, and gender. So there's a background to, and I just can't imagine doing feminism anywhere in Africa in a non-intersectional way, given the disparities. Even the intelligentsia never forget, despite the accusations from anti-feminists, your elite, etc. Yes, many of us are highly educated, but we never forget the interests of the majority of women. And it's evident in the kinds of organizing, it's evident all the way back to the anti-colonial struggles. Women formed cross-class and across colonies, across classes, across ethnicities. In many places, the first national or even continental structures were founded by women's networks. So this is worth bearing in mind. So the radical potential of Western feminism, I think, has been recuperated by black feminism, and it means that we can find use in it. It's no accident that the 1980s saw a massive efflorescence of feminist movements everywhere, but especially in Africa. It was that critical conjuncture that included the UN Decade for Women, as well as the prevailing of justice through the international anti-apartheid movement that supported the boycotts and shifted public opinion to isolate and overcome that last dastardly colony, South Africa. So these were landmark events in which Western corporate interest and support for the South African regime, which had already prolonged the SADC national liberation movements for decades by fueling the counter-revolutionaries, what now the Americans would call counter-insurgencies. So liberation was delayed. So when it finally came, it did require a global movement. But during the period since then, the feminist theory has begun to acquire the levels of sophistication necessary for more radical and transnational thinking. So the principles were there, but in terms of actually applying those in political movements and research, that work is ongoing, developing them, honing the tools, and applying them in very different and specific contexts in a meaningful way. So that's where I shall now turn. As is evident, Africa is not just home to me in a profoundly personal, historical, and philosophical way. It's also a place that grounds my intellectual contributions and where I do believe they're most relevant. So I'm very happy that all of you came to hear about African feminism, and I hope it will I hope you will be pleased with what I present, because I didn't really design the work for a Western audience. It's my first try at this, so bear with me. You may have to travel with me a little. Okay. So, briefly, the 19th and 20th century European empires that preceded flag independence, I've suggested, laid down the systems, and particularly the systemic gendered class and ethnic inequalities that continue to trouble African governance and politics and the possibilities of democratization today. I do also think that whereas feminism in general is simply the struggle for the theory and practice of women's liberation, nonetheless, the political and intellectual possibilities that come from a feminist epistemology aren't universal. So that's why I'm saying I'm going to take three distinct places, not in a political comparative framework, but to see what they tell us about the approach and help us develop it. Feminist epistemologies are very clear on this through the commitment to reflexivity, thinking on what we're thinking and the hows and whys of thinking the way we're thinking, and how that thought applied changes the idea in the first place. So this continuous praxis, recursive relationships that are ongoing, and we live them. So as we inhabit particular political and social conjunctures, we're living those contradictions and complexities. So it has to be sort of in our blood to keep thinking. Okay. One of the key questions that I'm interested in all three countries is that one, how does feminist thought inform and emerge out of gender political struggles waged by women's movements in these three places? Starting with Ghana, before that, I'll say that political independence it's often forgotten, I have to mention it therefore, a big leap forward. We're very critical of the failures of political independence, but really, can you imagine still being colonies? It's uncountenanceable. So I want to remind us how this was indeed a great leap forward. And for most African women, it was your entry into citizenship, because the first thing that post-colonial independent African governments did was give us citizenship. In many countries where the colonial regime classified women as minors, African women were minors. So at first we became citizens, and that you can't understate what that meant in terms of the hopes it generated and the expectations and the possibilities. So it's worth reminding ourselves that women were as vested in political independence and still are even more invested in independence and democratization and, above all, economic change to the prevailing economic systems that have continued to feminize poverty 3 decades after the concept was discovered. The gender dynamics of the global economy haven't improved. More women work, yes, globally, but the conditions under which they work are as exploitative as ever. So is that a victory? I don't know. African women want to work less, by the way, above and beyond everything. Okay, so the movements against colonial rule in Ghana, Uganda, and Zimbabwe took place at different times. Ghana first, 1958, the first African country to gain flag independence from British colonial rule and a powerhouse for pan-Africanism. Uganda around the same time, but their independence was very quickly followed by complete military dictatorship through coups, Idi Amin, bad news. And then Zimbabwe was not liberated until the armed struggle was victorious in 1980. So that is the newest of the three, if you like. While Ghana and Uganda, in the tradition of non-settler colonies, transitioned through political activism and party formation and mobilized, and women played key roles in bringing Nkrumah's Convention People's Party to power. In Uganda, there was a very problematic transition. But Zimbabwe fought a liberation war, as seems to be the case with colonies where people actually go and settle and displace. So they're living right next to the people they've dispossessed across generations. So that has tended to be a very violent transition because they won't let go or leave. They want, it's a different scenario, let's face it. So, starting with Ghana, local feminist analyst Georgie Tsikata traces women's political activism to their involvement in the anti-colonial protests. This is true in many places where the colonial economy was really sabotaging women's livelihoods. So, the anti-colonial protests over the cocoa hold-ups in 1917, 1918, these are instances of collective militancy. Really basic, born out of threats to the livelihoods. We're still reacting to threats to livelihoods so many years later. But at the time, there were two political organizations, and both of them collaborated with the Convention People's Party Women's Section on Political Issues. And Nkrumah came to power ahead of the rest of the world in terms of he was one of the first to put in affirmative action, and he astonished Western governments by appointing women to very high offices. But it was the era of women's wings, and he wasn't radically feminist at all, but he did believe in basic democratization, which carries us a long way. So he was a breakthrough moment, definitely. And there were also many early Ghanaian women intellectuals who could well be described as feminists. Efua Sutherland, Ama Ata Edu come to mind. And of course, before them, Mabel Dove Dankwa, a journalist who wrote under a male name a lot, and several pseudonyms because her radicalism, whatever, she decided to be discreet. But the politics of the first independent government can be summed up, in fact they have been, by Tsikata, noted that it consciously encouraged the participation of women in politics and public life, with the result that a few women held high political offices as members of parliament, deputy ministers, district commissioners. These were not acts of tokenism, but a recognition of their abilities. However, this did not really change the general gender biases within the political system or anything else, and it certainly didn't transform anything. And of course, the Nkrumah government was interrupted by a CIA-backed coup that ousted him in 1966. So he didn't even have a decade to do the nation-building work. After that, it gets worse. A series of military regimes ensued, and it doesn't really require much analysis, so I won't dwell on it, to confirm that almost 3 decades of uninterrupted military rule, I have to say something I'm very familiar, having grown up under it next door in Nigeria, but it's a modernizing, masculine and authoritarian kind of regime that completely interrupts political life in general and stalled, of course, women's entry into the political and public life until that critical conjuncture of the 1980s. Need I say more? Military rule is all-male rule. The involvement of women is very particular, as we shall see. In the end of the 70s, a dynamic socialist resistance movement emerged with its own intellectual vanguard in Ghana, the New Democratic Movement and others. And there are a number of feminists who we now know as leading feminist intellectuals in the leadership of the NDM. And many of the feminists I've interviewed actually got their political baptism working in those revolutionary spaces. However, that was preempted by first one coup and then another, and a new form of state feminism was introduced through the Rawlings dictatorship in the person of Nana Rawlings, who was very happy, I think, to become the most powerful woman in the country and command a mass mobilization of women, referred to as the 31st December movement. It was very similar to the Nigerian version of state feminism, and actually it's like the colonial feminism. It's in the service of the regime, in the service of her husband's regimes. This is not to say it did nothing. She had command of all the resources of the state, and became powerful enough to completely sideline both the national structure for women, national machinery set up after Nairobi, in fact set up by Nkrumah long before Nairobi, and also any other independent organizing. And I'm saying NDM women and the Rawlings were in the same political debates, and she literally took over another women's organization when she became head of state's wife and marginalized all the others. So not much happened, but on the international landscape, they loved Nana Rawlings. Gave her lots of money, and it really generated a backlash. This was not feminism, but it was enough to antagonize ordinary people against women's movements, because the state was a dictatorship. So let's not be fooled. If a women's movement is directed by an anti-democratic, repressive regime that detained and locked up lots of real activists, we can't actually put faith in it. I think African feminists have learned this quite well. Key organizations on the ground in Ghana, Abantu for Development, the Network for Women's Rights. I don't have time to go into too much detail, but what I'm interested to share with you is the way in which the understanding, that the kind of analysis that's informing these organizations is actually being produced by key activists. So they're part of the women's movement. And for example, the whole national initiative to generate a women's political platform, the Women's Manifesto, was born out of a research study a few years earlier, which the same Georgette Carter directed, which did detailed studies of 8 national machinery of 8 countries. I was one of the studies, comparing these Nairobi recommended structures for women and demonstrating they were totally ineffective. They were not being resourced, they were not attending to women, and they were alienated from women's movements. They didn't like civil society, they didn't trust. So the national machinery thing. So I'm mentioning that because Ghana had a small National Council for Women Development that was marginalized during the Rawlings period, but due to a lot of activism and anti-violence activism in particular, when the government changed through an electoral process in 2001, they announced a ministry. Now, they all knew the problems of a ministry and had studied in depth all the different variations, desk, directorate, ministry, commission, and knew that a commission was the one that would be activist within government. And a ministry is a bureaucracy with a minister. And the minister actually, as it happened, turned out to be the major obstacle to what women's movement agendas that were being pursued. There was a whole spate of serial killings that went on prior to this regime change. And in fact, mass demonstrations of women may have been partly responsible for the electoral failure of the Rawlings and their replacement. I'm not saying they caused it, but it was definitely a factor discrediting the Rawlings. But then the Minister for Women's Affairs, she's now late, may she rest in peace, she blocked all the national campaign to set up anti-violence legislation and delayed it for 5 years. I mean, that's no small crime when you know how many women were killed. 35 were murdered, and wife killing is a regular feature of many countries, including Ghana. So, but the arguments, she like many women in the state, she's articulating family values and scandalous, slurring the reputations of feminists who were professors at the universities, some of them. So you see the state's machinery for women obstructing a feminist pursuit of a just reform, a mere legal reform. And, there are worse cases. When it came, I don't want to spend too long on Ghana, I have many stories, but when they came to launch the Women's Manifesto, it's a major public rally involving trade unions, civil society, a broad front coalition, the minister took the hall that they had booked and announced that she was presenting a national gender policy, which no one had heard of. So the kind of games, foibles, that was the structure for women. In the end, the women's movement worked with the Attorney General to begin the domestic violence law campaign. But as I said, you cannot presume structures for women are not even more antagonistic than, say, a liberal Attorney General, the one who's now president, as it happens. We'll see. He abandoned it before it was achieved, but it was partly his presence that made it possible to start the bill and the campaign. So, but today, all said and done, Ghanaian feminists have learned a great deal from these machinations and are advancing much more sophisticated understandings of not the state, but the layers and the sites of power and the processes, and in a sense they've had to been forced through a harsh political awakening in terms of real politics and the nature of the multi-party substitution of multi-party elections for any kind of real democracy. So they're a tough and critical bunch, and they're continuously working in new areas. Recently, Netrite, another key organization, produces policy papers on the emergent oil and gas sector to ensure that women are not treated as badly as they have been on the basis of the research around mining and environmental destruction. So I'm saying they're state-of-the-art with a broad suite of skills, intellectual, political, organizational, and very committed to collective mobilizations, and have been able to turn out thousands, not hundreds of thousands like a government. I note that. I think it's important. There's a limit to what non-government organizations can do if they can't prevail on power. That tells us, which all of them have realized, you can't stop working with the state. You can never let up. The state, even as African states may well need saving themselves, it is the institution that mediates between us and global corporations. We know what it is to have countries with no states. There are few around, Somalia. It can only be worse. So it may seem liberal, but actually it's a radical politic, not just to get into the state through inclusion, which some of these regimes have happily included selected women. You have to actually change, turn, and work with the political forces. Zimbabwe. Here's an excerpt. Harare, 14th of August, 2017. Shuvai Ben Muhofa is dead, and it is Heroes' Day in Harare. Today, the 37th year of paying tribute to the aging cohort of veterans regularly acknowledged by the Commander-in-Chief, President Robert Mugabe, will she be declared a hero? There are precious few women among those who've been officially honored as national heroes, so perhaps not. She's dead after a political career that began in the 1950s National Democratic Party. And when it was banned, she joined ZAPU before becoming a ZANU cadre in 1979, where she remained loyal to the end. Her service to ZANU. So I'm quoting that. It happened while I was there. And the debate there is about the nature of women's participation and liberation of Zimbabwe. And the very romanticized, I'm going to be critical of it, that idea of the woman freedom fighter, otherwise referred to in some writings as women who carried guns. There's a particular romanticism around what it meant for women to carry guns and live in the bush, and what the contribution of women fighters was. And frankly, women or men fighters, the gun bearers, would never have got anywhere. We're talking about small guerrilla bands who lived in bush camps. What made it possible? It's that Guevara thing, the fish in the sea. The people made it possible. Support, subterfuge. And that is where I would say women did the most, frankly. Feeding, logistics, supplies, communication, spying, etc., etc. These were the stuff that made that victory possible. So, yes, the gun-bearing woman on the posters. Not an accident that this becomes an iconic image in the context of the UN decade. It has international appeal, and it's a hit. Of course, the woman with the gun has a baby on her back. So the discussion on the ground in Africa even then was, well, what about a man with a baby? Why does she have to have both? I mean, what a terrible idea, a woman going into combat with a baby on her back. So you can see this is an iconic image that's serving certain political purposes. Seductive, perhaps, but not if you knew what women went through in the bush. And it has taken the research of local feminists to unearth and expose what happened to all those young women who ran away to the war. And there's a film and there's some writing on it that's very informative and very upsetting if you bought that image. But think really, living in bush camps, being impregnated by commanders, being expected to service, and even within the guerrilla forces, there's a gender division of labor. What did women mostly do? Sent out to mobilize men by shaming them for being cowards. Send a girl and the men have to sign up. They use women porterage, camps, bush camps. You're talking about carrying equipment miles and miles. I won't labor it, but the labor division is very clear, and it's sexual servicing. While it was against policy, commanders were not prevented. So women had multiple issues, and there's a lot of recognition, but it tends to be verbal. Mugabe, 1983. Our women have scored numerous victories alongside the men. They've demonstrated beyond all doubt that they are as capable as men and deserve equal treatment in regard to both training and appointments. And there was a policy against having sexual relations, but they didn't provide contraception. So girls that got pregnant were sent to a particular camp to deliver. Why did they include women when they were still so sexist? And it meant taking girls from traditional patriarchal homesteads into the bush. Fei Chung credits the head of Zanla, military supremo, the late Josiah Tongogara, for introducing the inclusion of women at every level, following his training in China and Mozambique. Very much a socialist thing, include women at every level. Mugabe embraced this proposal, observing that they had neglected women and relied on conservative tradition. We turned out first a few, then a few hundreds, then several hundreds, until we had several thousands. Who can deny that this was a correct decision? Mugabe, 1983. Yet, despite thousands of women joining the struggle in the bush and carrying out these hazardous tasks, despite that, and despite the fact that when victory came, Mugabe did introduce a whole series of laws, first of all, legal age of majority. Yay, women get to be citizens. I mean, that was huge. And several other pieces of legislation which affected a minority of women until they did the Land and Inheritance Act and the LAMA, that Legal Age of Majority Act. These met with huge resistance. Because they had implications not just for educated urban women, like the Sex Offences and the Sex Disqualification Act, but because they actually touched key issues which have been proved quite intractable, the issues of sexual politics and the issues of land and property ownership. There isn't a country that has managed, where women feminists have managed to push, not because they haven't tried, but because that's where liberal tolerance and instrumental inclusion ends. We're talking about dividing the resources and women controlling their bodies. It's not flying. Nowhere is it flying. Even stopping violence has taken enormous struggle. So the Land Inheritance Act that made it a possibility was defeated. It was passed into law, but within a year, the landmark case set a precedent that gave customary law superiority over the law. So it's defunct, it doesn't work. Tradition rules, cultural claims rule. And of course, that's a regression to the colonial scenario. So even today, Zimbabwean land rights remain embedded. And today, after massive land reform, land invasions, then formalized as land reform, even now, the way they've regularized that and made it policy still relies on old patriarchal authority and memory. Whose land was this? So it's reproducing. Women, the vast majority, up to 90%, are rural farmers, can only acquire access to land through marriage. That's the tradition. Okay, Mugabe's cynicism around land. For example, he made a statement, if women want to own property, then they should not get married. It's cynical, given the public stigmatization of unmarried women in post-war Zimbabwe. No sooner had the ink had barely dried on the Legal Age of Majority Act than, for some reason, the state embarked on a massive operation called Operation Cleanup, which people have probably heard about, just literally scooping women on their way home from work off the streets and detaining them on the basis that they were guilty of prostitution. This was something that happened regularly in colonial times. Mugabe did it in 1983. So this thing of unleashing security forces, and sadly the public men often join in to harass and intimidate women on the basis of alleged sort of sexual politics, suspicion of immorality, has occurred not just once but several times. and clearly contradicts the official position of the regime. So you have it with one hand, looking modern, introducing legal reforms. I'm not saying these aren't important, but when with the other hand, there's this intimidation, mass harassment, intimidation, you can see what, so this is a kind of contradiction that has provoked feminists to organize movements. 1983, the cleanup provoked the formation of the Women's Action Group, and indeed a whole series of organizations formed to try and push for the legal reforms to be pursued, to be further, to actually be implemented in the context of an extremely misogynistic culture which targeted women who'd been former freedom fighters, media campaigns. Do freedom fighters make good wives? Apparently not. Get yourself a good traditional girl, get rid of that bush whore. You know, that kind of shift to conservatism. And all the women who were impregnated, no comrades would help them find the fathers. They all had false names. So the sabotage, and on top of all the single mothers as a product of war, you then have a media campaign about women accused of baby dumping, of infanticide. But there's almost nothing women can do if they've been impregnated by through a chain of command, and can't find, anyway. But scandal mongering and attacking the reputations of those women who should have been being celebrated as veterans. So that continued. I think part of the misogyny, I mean, if you go back to Lancaster House, there wasn't a single woman on the delegation. Women may have fought in the bush, but they were not on the delegation negotiating the first constitution. By the time of the second constitutional process, there was a women's movement. And interestingly, the new generation of women's organizations that formed between 1983 forward were very, very involved with it. In fact, there was a couple of feminists involved in starting the whole constitutional process that became incredibly problematic. But there was an independent civil society movement demanding a new constitution because Lancaster House was with the British and terribly compromised. And feminists were involved in it from day one. But interestingly, the Independent Constitutional Commission, it's an interesting idea because governments do constitutions, but this was a civil society movement demanding a constitution, ended up being chaired by a woman who was the director of the leading feminist organization. So you had the biggest and most effective NGO at that time was the ZW, Zimbabwe Women's Resource Center and Network. Their director was then chairing the Constitutional Commission. I mean, we're talking some serious political visibility and power. But the reason she became the chair of the Constitutional Commission was because Morgan Tsvangirai decided to make a party. Of course, that meant that the civil society coalition, it was polarized, MDC, ZANU. And it tore the women's movement apart. The women's movement had been started by a number of women who'd been ZANU people who then left the government when it started downsizing on its gender politics and downsized the ministry. These women had been involved in the first mass education and outreach, the very progressive programs that ZANU began with. And when they saw it changing, they left and formed independent organizations. Nonetheless, as was the case in Ghana, there was a lot of collaboration between branches of government and the independent movement. But when this constitutional thing polarized, it also split the women's movement to pro and anti-government. And the constitution got a no vote because that was like no to ZANU. The constitution that women had not only fought and been very involved in constructing, which had a lot of gains for women, significant gains that were never recovered, as it happens. What they learned through that was in a sense, the harshness of real politics. You had ZANU and MDC both getting their women on their sides. The wisdom of feminism is amazing. They formed a separate women's constitutional coalition and drafted what should have been a national constitutional approach that women wanted and sent it to both sides. So you're talking about some very good strategy there. How am I doing? 5, 10? Okay. Tell me. Because, I can talk when I get excited, especially. 5. Okay. Yeah, no. So, but I need to get into some of that detail to kind of convey the way women have learned and responded, and the way women's movements just keep reconvening, no matter what. Mass arrests, detentions, closures of organizations, members becoming persona non grata. There's a lot of this stuff goes on all the time. But then they rose to the challenge, got fully involved at national political level. It cost dearly. It really broke that organization apart. Yet there are people diligent and committed enough to say, look, let's reconvene. And then it helped by a next generation. Some will never come back. But on the other hand, the movement is still there because they reconvene. And indeed, that women's coalition of Zimbabwe remained on the ball throughout the ensuing years. The constitution didn't come through till 2013, and in the interim, there was a terrible crisis and many more violent operations. But that movement, it's been severely weakened, but it hasn't gone, it hasn't disappeared. And there are a lot of new style organizations which look very different from the traditional 1980s ones, forming in the early 2000s, which I don't have time to detail, but they're very interesting. Some very young women doing very dynamic participatory community theatres around rape and violence, and really pushing the envelope at the cultural arena, popular level, rather than just focused on the state. So there's some change strategies, some new strategies. Last of all, I'll say a few words on Uganda. I won't bother to detail how brutal the Idi Amin regime was, or the Obote regime. They were so bad. Hundreds of thousands of people died. They victimized women regularly. Rape was an everyday affair. And I've interviewed women who were disappeared for 2-3 years, subjected to everything, lost everything. It was horrifying what happened. There's a powerful book on it by a young historian, Cory Decker. He imposed dress codes. This is something very common in a number of countries, which licensed the security forces and men in public to harass, intimidate, rip women's clothes off. If the mini skirt was deemed to be mini, wigs were banned, trousers were banned, until Idi Amin Dada learned that actually Muslim women do wear trousers. And then he recanted on that one. Anyway, so all of that was bad news. So Ugandan women really did not get any chance to come into the political space through that period, rather like the Ghanaian or and they didn't even bother to have any kind of state feminism. It was total patriarchy and very violent and brutal until 1980 to 1986. Yoweri Museveni took to the bush with a little band of guerrillas and became the first army to overthrow a ruling state. Took hold of the state. He involved women. He learned from Frelimo. He also had a lot of socialist rhetoric. Here's an excerpt. Women fought in Uganda too. A lot was made of it. You always heard about these women cadres fighting for the NRA. On the 30th, here's an extract. On the 33rd anniversary, I've been looking for evidence of these women, and it's very hard to find. But during the 33rd anniversary celebration of the start of the Bush War, the Daily Monitor, big paper, carried a celebration of the top 100 war heroes, providing brief details on their rank and heroic acts. There's only one. The first entry on a woman is at number 29, Joy Mirembe. It reads RO/00029, Lieutenant Joy Mirembe, in brackets, deceased. And it reads, the only woman combatant among the 100 heroes, she died in childbirth during the war. Commander Mirembe, together with Olivia Zizinga, Gertrude Njuba, and Brigadier Proscovia Nalweso, were some of the few and very first women to join the Bush War. I can't get how she died in childbirth in the Bush War, and there's no explanation. And I've not been able to find much more info. It doesn't mention any military achievements, in contrast to all the male heroes' write-ups. There's work to be done there to uncover it. NRM stalwart Winnie Byanyima, and an out feminist forever, is convinced that the NRM, which she joined when he took to the bush, could not have survived long, and it could certainly not have won the war had it not succeeded in winning the support. Same story as Zimbabwe, local populations. And she confirms the multiple roles that women played. She says, if I may quote briefly. How are you doing? You okay? Okay. The leaders were hiding and living among the peasants. They started finding they could trust women to conceal fighters, nurse casualties, etc. And it goes on and on. But basically, she's arguing this war could never have been won. Same story. I needn't dwell on it. When he came to government, Museveni also took dramatic steps to include women. But over time, I can't detail it, it became clear that women were disposable assets, and all the major gains in the political space were conditional on uncritical support for his regime while he rebuilt dictatorship under the no-party system. So women have been treated as disposable in the sense that even the deputy prime minister was randomly sacked and humiliated when at some point when he found her no longer useful. So the feminists, there were some in the original NRM, not many, they were mostly women, but Winnie, for example, was a feminist, defected, joined the opposition, actually married the opposition leader. But what the women's movement has had to come to terms with is the fact that they were very collaborative, some would say complicit in building that dictatorship, because he recruited them. He did introduce structures, policies, legal reforms, affirmative action for the elite, not a primary level, incidentally. He did a lot of good things, and it was very compelling. And at that time, the whole world, you can read the Western scholarship on it, yay, this is it. The feminist revolution is here. All this raises the question of whether a revolutionary change can ever come from the barrel of a gun, what we used to call in African debates barrack socialism born in the military barracks. The answer, I think, is clear from women's experience, certainly. No, you will be tricked, you will be used, be recruited, you may get some gain, so you can't not be, would you refuse to be complicit? It's a very, very subtle thing, and it's not that these women are naive at all. They understand the necessity to continue even with a dictatorial state. It's in command of resources, but that's an integral thread of a broader understanding that democratization is absolutely necessary for feminist advances. Doesn't mean that democratization, any more than socialism, will guarantee the accomplishment of feminist agendas, but it is very clear that the terrain becomes very different. It's difficult to deal with the fact, like, just jumping back to Ghana, Ghana still has the low political participation level that it had at independence, where he appointed some women, and it hasn't progressed, whereas these dictatorships with affirmative action, yes, there's more than 30% women there, but it's not about critical mass, as the current debates and activism is around, it's about critical capacity. So women's movements have constantly kept on the case of all those women who are in office, trying to turn them, basically, to educate them, to collaborate with them, and stop, don't go away, don't they insult you, keep going back, send someone else, but keep working them over. And there have been training initiatives that have improved some of the women who are elected, but the appointment system has been profoundly problematic because of its disposability. So it's been unable to serve feminist agendas, except when they were about promoting the dictator. So you can see how women, you can't just say they've been used, because it's not that they didn't know. In Uganda, when Museveni came to power, a number of feminists insisted on setting up independent organizations and continue to leverage. Right now, things are very repressive. So you're seeing women demonstrators being rounded up and arrested, and public protest has become very difficult. But there's a pretty diverse and far-reaching women's movement that's having to work covertly. So those are my 3 studies. I'm going to sum up with the questions. Are you still with me? Okay. So you can see how I've argued that women have moved. They're still on the cutting edge of change, but from being freedom fighters in guerrilla armies or early appointees, they've moved towards, on the front lines now, it's not women with guns, but feminists equipped with a pretty impressive combination of skills and a political vision that includes, obviously, what you'd now call an intersectional approach. There's a constant anti-bourgeois focus on how we work with grassroots communities, how we get beyond the capital, and the resource questions are sometimes insurmountable. That takes money. Huge countries we're talking about. But nonetheless, the skills are all there for very, very sophisticated forms of activism. And that development has taken place usually through small NGOs with tiny budgets. So I'm saying that the work that women have done with very limited resources is far in excess of anything that's ever been funded. So this thing about being donor-driven, women are as savvy at securing funds and manipulating it to pursue a certain kind of agenda. And as these movements have got stronger, some of them have been able to push back, reject certain donors and favor others. And of course now there's actually an African Women's Development Fund created by feminists to, I call it shift money, clean it up between donors and guarantee more independence among movements. It's not big, but it's significant. So, Uganda, when I left in 2017, it was in a crisis over, guess what, a series of brutal murders of women, just like the Ghanaian ones, all around Entebbe, women being brutally murdered, mutilated, and displayed. And sexual politics receded from women and digressed into extreme homophobia. So bad that the state security now has to restrain the public. And the Minister for Ethics and Integrity constantly harasses and threatens the queer women activists who live pretty much underground. So that transition has also seen a change and a development of feminism, a greater willingness to engage with issues of gender and sexuality. The homophobia in Uganda has forced the feminist movement to shift its position. So now in Uganda, if you say you're homophobic or if you show you're homophobic, you will be discounted as a feminist. And that's new. It wasn't like that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And of course, feminist movements have been at the forefront of defeating the anti-homosexuality bill and quietly giving cover to those who've not been able to cross the border when they're under threat. So disengagement has never been an option. Instead, we have quite a high level of strategic engagement that's becoming more sophisticated through painful lessons and painful experiences. These all affirm the need for autonomous feminist organizing. They also affirm that in certain contexts, and it's most evident in Ghana, where there's a very large intelligentsia, the role of intellectuals in feminism is really quite important in terms of the strategic acumen, the research, the evidence production, and setting out political agendas that are much more far-reaching than the campus. All three countries have developed gender and women's studies teaching in the national universities. So there's endless capacity building and training going on all the time. So these are some of the quiet things that explain why suddenly a domestic violence law campaign or a manifesto campaign becomes a major national event. And they've become very adept at coalition building. So the initial atomization that was a problem with NGOs, everyone competing for scarce pots of money and therefore specializing, is being overcome through coalition building. So we're able to turn out far more people and mobilize them. All of this demands a much more sophisticated feminist political theory than those you find in the textbooks, because it shows the complexity of the state and the way power works. And of course, our states are fairly unique in their propensity to revert to military dictatorships. We're hoping that's been pushed past, and women have been continuously campaigning against military dictatorship because it excludes women completely. So there are degrees of harshness, and the point is that the pervasiveness of different kinds of feminist strategy, despite these very long periods of conflict in at least two countries, those two, Ghana, Zimbabwe and Uganda, and military dictatorship in all three. And the women's movement has had to learn not to trust all these claims by revolutionary politicians, and they prompt that old question, socialism, can it be delivered from the barrel of a gun? Feminist strategies suggest it won't be, and there are many, many other ways to fight and to struggle. In the absence of democracy, we've learned what feminism can still do. in a totalitarian regime, and a lot of it is pedagogic, it's about conscientization, it's about learning, it's often very quiet work, so it doesn't necessarily have a big front. Every now and then it bursts into public awareness, but that doesn't mean that things are not, lots and lots of work is going on all the time in a very steady and clear-sighted way. The examples of the key feminist organizations demonstrate this growth and the substantial political experience that women and the feminist movements have accumulated over these last 3 decades. However, the majority are still grossly under-resourced, and as conditions, economic conditions have got harsher, the pressure to even find time beyond livelihood issues, even for the middle class, is extreme. So nowadays, of course, with funding retraction, having built up civil society, that's now going to be, instead of the state, now that civil society's funding's being withdrawn, we're all having to think again. So I do think we're at a watershed moment where women's movements have to acquire their own premises for a start, because no one will fund the rent anymore. And it's forcing new thinking and experiments and new types of bringing people together. And the cross-border exchanges have remained very, very important, and a source of inspiration that, frankly, no self-respecting feminist should be ashamed of. It's never been Western. We can borrow from wherever we want, and it's not a crime to be a highly educated feminist. So these are some of the messages that I want to put out there for sure. Stop being pushed back by backward, irrelevant remarks that are still very prevalent. So, in sum, feminism in these 3 post-independence countries responds directly to the failures of nationalism and nation building, and catalyzes new levels of consciousness reflected in all that feminist educational research and organizing work that has underpinned the movement building. At the same time, public anti-feminism persists, and cultural arguments are regularly invoked in conservative ways, and all the more so with the rise of various kinds of, I don't know what to call them, an excess of religiosity. This is a huge problem. Women are big in the church. Women are very easily recruited by anyone who can provide minimal welfare, and that includes the church and all Muslim organizations. They're delivering where government has been disabled from delivering through structural adjustment. Governments cannot provide, they're not allowed to provide since economic reforms were introduced in the 70s onwards. So, devil and deep blue sea. Meanwhile, the services that these small, some of them are quite big actually, NGOs provide have become critical to the survival of women who suffer abuse, violence, want to flee their husbands. So the caring work that should have been done by the public sector has been taken on. So we're also talking about organizations that are extremely burdened and do huge work. So it's amazing to me that they manage to do what they do. Finally, I'll say that the radicalization of women that began in the period after independence is continuing, and the cross-border role, the sharing, women's manifestos in one country, then another, then another, then another, through the pan-African structures we now have, and which I haven't been able to describe, are very important, as is the skill with which feminists, even more than governments, presidents, have been able to exploit the international arena and pursue agendas and secure some support for what they're doing. And if we have a role in the West, it would be to try and encourage that kind of support. And if we have an epistemological role, it would be say, our role is limited, concentrate on training local researchers for the next generation and developing local writing, because we are in an information era. This stuff matters. Thank you for your patience and attention.
Thank you so much for this absolutely rich instructive, impressing, and inspiring talk you gave. I have a bunch of questions I could raise immediately, but I can imagine, since what you provided to us was, for many of us, probably much of new information, the more in terms of the contextualizations you provided, so that I can imagine that there are many questions amongst the audience. So please feel free to raise questions of understanding, to ask for more details if you need, to give comments, whatever you want. But if you need a little time to reflect, give me the chance to raise the questions I have. So, but first of all, are there any immediate questions? Okay, if this is not, is there one? Okay, so then you start, please.
Thank you so very much for your presentation. That was fascinating. I'm curious, and you just touched on religion right at the end, and I have so many questions on that note, which I can't all put out here. But I'm an anthropologist, and I work in East Africa, in Zanzibar, which is a 98% Muslim state today. And I work on the practice of child beating and what international organizations are trying to do to get people to stop that, and how that is locally perceived, which is often in a very negative way because it is considered to be a westernizing or anti-Islamic undertaking. And it's often been women who told me that, very much in the face of religious justificatory narratives, and not for the sake of colonialism or colonialist practice, child beating, often also equated with wife beating and with considering women as minors, is for religious reasons justified and not connected to anything outside of that. And I'm so curious to hear from you, and I'm asking for advice basically on how to deal with that as an anthropologist working on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Please add other questions. Let us take a collection of. Yeah, Kira is adding something.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. You presented us with 3 case studies, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the transnational dimensions of the feminist struggles, and to what extent maybe the feminists in these 3 different countries have been benefiting from transnational feminist support, how it has maybe, historically informed those struggles, but also how it's that maybe changed today with the possibilities that you were mentioning in terms of sort of enhanced transnational communication and exchange. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Mama. My question is around polarization, which you touched on in the many layers you talked about, the difficult relationship to the state that forces us to come into a harsh political reality, or to a realization of the harsh political reality, and as feminists with our interventions. And from what I took most is that we have a chance to learn from the successes, but also mostly the failures of feminist interventions, despite the state, with and despite the state. So I'd like to ask the question of polarization also with the present in mind. In the global order, we're seeing that democracy, in a certain level, is on the decline as a consensual model, and with the anti-feminist movements that target us at different levels, the state also being one of these anti-feminist agents in many cases, it seems to me that polarization the way you talked about it from the social, historical, political perspective of these three post-colonial nations, that one of the elements was to regain control over women and our political force by polarizing the women's movement in a way that we're not able to move anymore. And you spoke about the history of the left and communist transnational movement, and as left and progressive people, we are also in this stalemate where we are polarized now, and where there's little movement in the sense of social critical movements. So it seems to me to be an issue that's relevant to us as African feminists, as transnational African Afro-diasporic feminists, but also to the political left. But we are now in a very polarized situation where sometimes I think it's not even to gain control, but it's to hinder us from getting out of the control of a certain violent system and order, and to play with alternatives. I'm not saying we'd do it better, but I am saying that there's this hold on us to stay in this violent system. So my question is around what kind of strategies do you think we can learn from the failures around polarization for our situation now as African feminists, Afro-diasporic feminists, but as the left, progressive left in general?
Maybe we save yours for the second round, since these have been good, but also deep questions.
Yeah, deep questions. Is it working? Hello? Can you hear me? Yes, good, okay. The anthropology of religion. Violence finds different rationales at different times in my observation. So that one period, the manifestations of violence will be centered around ethnicity. And the next period, sometimes on the very same territory, they will manifest through the trope of religion. The language with which behavior, bad or good, is explained will be the language of religion in deeply religious societies. And as you know, the appeal to Islamic texts is a site of huge contestation among Muslim feminists. There's a whole network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which engages in engaging with Islamic jurisprudence and Sharia law, refining it and arguing about the texts. So, it's a very subjective thing. I would say it's a strategy, and there are many repressive aspects in all our traditions. The thing about childhood, it sounds a bit like feminism being imported. It is true, though, in the case of childhood, that as you will see, the international scandal about child labor and child fighters, in many countries, childhood has not yet been fully realized. People don't even have childhood in many countries. It's an aspirational trope that originated in Europe in the Industrial Revolution. So it's relatively modern, and we ain't there yet in terms of children being untouchable. I mean, in the US campuses, you're not even allowed to touch a student in case it's a molestation. So that's a bit extreme, but that is the situation. So the notions of discipline and physicality do differ from one place to another. And I don't know if you're talking about spanking or flogging to death. It depends. But bad behavior will always find its justification, and so will violence. I don't know if that's helpful. But it is because they're 98% Muslim, and being good is being Muslim, so it speaks for itself. Kira, the transnational, gosh, it's been huge throughout the history of feminism in Africa, and it is one of the things I'm very keen for us to recuperate. I mean, it matters that Huda Sharawi went to Europe and then came back and tore off her veil and decided, yes, women could invade the parliament and demand political rights in 1920s Egypt. And I've no doubt that travel, getting out of her harem and traveling to Europe and seeing things different, inspired her. But I tend to also look at it the other way around and say, European women accepted that their gendered allocation lot in life as housewives and so on was There are a lot, and actually feminist anthropologies traveled to African places and saw women building houses, trading, making money, doing things they never dreamt they could do in their corseted, sheltered lives, and were inspired. So I suspect, I would argue, that you could argue that gender theory, the idea that gender oppression is socially and historically constructed, was learned by the travels of European women. They learned it from us, and we saw it. So whenever you cross borders and see different possibilities, I think it's a liberating thing. As an educator, I strongly advocate it, and I think we should embrace the fact that the major world philosophies and political philosophies have all been deeply cosmopolitan, and their global heritage, even more than Levi's. So you see, nobody complains about men wearing Levi's in Africa. So, this thing about what it came from, the question of essential origins deep in some kind of sacrosanct culture, I think is passé, especially now. And now you don't even have to go anywhere. You can just switch on your laptop. And the proliferation and spread of LGBT discourses is a case in point. They're not, and there's a different issue there with the speed with which identities are adopted out of context. There are big issues there, which I can't go into. But I think the technology is an enormous asset. And on the continent, I will say that feminists were among the first to embrace it. And we did a whole lot of research on the uptake of ICTs before we decided to go with the open access journal, knowing fully that the rest of the world would be far bigger in terms of the readership, but we were retaining an editorial focus on what African feminists want to share and know, because there was never before a platform that we could say was for continental internal exchange. What that meant in terms of publishing was you could hardly get published because the big international journals can maybe accommodate one article from one African country every so often, but it certainly can't do what we need done, which is extensive, deeper knowledge that isn't of interest to everybody. So we're talking about different orders of publication. And the strategy was to make sure that African feminists could read it. It was precipitated. So it's a strategy for communication and movement building. It's not just a journal. And that is why it bridges. Which brings me, and I could talk at length about that. The strategy was carefully worked out collaboratively, and it began with a workshop bringing, for the first time, 30 African feminists together on the continent in the year 2000. It was amazing. Before that, we know that we only met each other one-on-one in New York, or maybe Frankfurt if we're lucky. But you only met in other people's as when you were being hosted by other people at distant locations. Other than that, there's the local stuff. So there's been a concerted effort to convene, to resume, I should say, convening at a continental level. So the feminist pan-African networks, for example, Femnet, the Feminist Communication Network that has its head office in Kenya, has hundreds of members all over the continent. It's multilingual, and it has been singularly effective in advocating at the level of the African Union. So the African Union's policies are way ahead of the EU's with regard to gender because of the activism. Now, I'm not saying we're implementing them, and there's more to it than implementation as a technical thing. But the point is you're pushing the discourse, and it's like inching forward. And it's often, feminists are very aspirational and visionary rather than, oh, this will never work. You can look at the empirical stuff and just be depressed. So it is creative. It isn't just a reflection. It's reflection and action and also critical imagination. We've got to unlock imagination if we want to change anything. We're really in danger of getting mired in the present. But yeah, what African women have done with tech, everything from cell phone banking to, a massive uptake and very, very different usages. But of course, we've jumped on it with Feminist Africa, and there are numerous now online fora. But you could trace the first pan-continental organization was actually the Pan-African or Women's Organization. Before there was an African organization on the continent, you had a Pan-African Women's Organization made up of the wives of Cabral and Nito and all those guys, the first nationalist generation. That still exists. They're a little elderly now, pushing the African Union to notice this thousands of new feminist organizations formed since 1962 when Power formed. But what I'm saying is the regionalism, it also it interacts with the global discourses and pushes them. So continental, as in pan-African feminism, has become a deliberate strategy now, not just for engaging the AU, but for engaging with the international arena. Similarly, all these national manifestos and national platforms, where the national machinery goes to the UN, presents, and doesn't tell the truth. You have independent national structures that are sending the activists to confront them there, because they won't see you at home. If you meet them there, it's a different story. So there's a lot of strategic understanding of what the different levels of activism can and cannot do. And clearly, the strategy for a long time has been at every level. So you have national organizers working with rural and doing a lot of local work. At the same time, certain organizations will play a national role, and then another set of organizations play sub-regional, lots of sub-regional associations, and then regional. And Africa has been very, very visible on the international arena since the 1970s, but very, I think, significantly. If you look through the UN, you look through who's got where, there's a big presence in the global development arenas as a result of feminist engagements with the development industry. So different grounds for different things. Bridging, that's the bridging question answered.
I also wanted to thank you very much for the very rich and stimulating lecture, and I have a question. You were mentioning a couple of times the traces of communism, socialism, but also you spoke about anti-bourgeois feminism, and I would very much like you to more elaborate on that. Is there something you could, in a way, figure out? What is there an anti-capitalist tendency? You mentioned it once in the struggles and the non-governmental, the NGOs and the current developments you could describe, because I was also wondering, this is also something I'm missing sometimes when we talk about post-colonial feminism, and also in Germany, the intersectionality approaches also sometimes marginalized class and political economy. Thanks.
Then maybe I can add something, at least one of my questions. Towards the end of your talk, I was surprised that you were so easy with the international donor context. So could you give me a bit, or us a bit more of reason why you are so easy with it? I mean, we know that there is a huge discussion around saying it is international money, it is the flow of donor money that really is driving and is shaping and is in the end responsible for at least 2/3 of what happens and what does not happen. So that's a big one.
Yes, I didn't go into the donor stuff. I mean, it's a huge discussion, and I would point to the fact that feminists in Africa have learned which donors will do what, and which ones are the ones to avoid working with, and which ones will try and shortcut, and I won't name names. But for example, the Women's Manifesto took a 1-year campaign because it was about building public consciousness and finding out what women wanted across a very large country. So the first grant came from donor X and said, oh, we'd love you to do a Women's Manifesto, we'll sponsor you, but we need the document in 1 month. So the money was there, but the understanding wasn't. They refused the funding, went around, so it took a while. And of course, as I often say, some of the best projects never get funded. And the real projects actually are not reliant on funding, the real work. But that kind of scenario. So when NGOs are well networked, and they need to keep working on this, it's not always the case, you can flip and persist with an agenda. So I think that the assumption that donors can determine and direct is a little misplaced. You need to put that alongside the fact that there are lots of people who are very opportunistic and will perform whatever donors want in order to get some kind of a livelihood. So, I mean, let's put those two things side by side and say what counts, therefore, is when feminists have the acumen and the confidence and perhaps the base that enables them to negotiate the agenda so they can actually do what they had in mind. And we're often doing donor education. I mean, this is where I think intellectual women need to play their role, because donors do prefer bypassing and going direct to grassroots and funding the digging of wells, which, so a de-skilling of a denial, a refuting of any local expertise, because frankly, the poorest and the most barefoot and pregnant are the most vulnerable, and they can't argue back. I've had this discussion in a lot of donor circles, and I did spend a while, 10 years, on the board of the Global Fund for Women. It's a feminist funder, but based in San Francisco. And the board was often divided between northern women with money and southern women with intellectual and political skills. So we have millionaires who were not always very highly educated, but had the money, and some of them would donate $1 million. So these debates, it's an ongoing discussion. I point to the diversity of donors, to the intelligence of and sophistication and the capacities that feminists have to negotiate with them. But if you're forced back to the bottom level and your donors are only going to work, as is increasingly the case, bypassing the local intelligence, ignoring the local movement, sometimes actually recruiting their staff and taking their ideas, and then inviting the heads of the women's organization to come and deliver for free because they were running. I mean, there's a lot of appropriation, very vexed and unpleasant stuff on the local level. So you have to sort of keep a strategic angle on it and understand, of course, donors aren't there to support us. They've got their own agendas and they're accountable to different people. And this thing of accountability is critical. They're accountable to communities elsewhere, not to you on the ground. So there is no monitoring or accountability of donors. It's just we that are monitor. That is power. And we just have to manipulate with it and do what we can. And some donors are worse than others. Some are very good, and a lot of them are staffed by well-meaning people who you can actually pursue conversations with, and those are the ones you want to work with, even if they're poorer, which they usually are. So I think where the money comes from matters. Hey, the revolution will never be funded. We know this. Put it simply. But we can get some money to do some useful things. Oh yeah, the anti-capitalism. Yeah, I mean, that as intellectuals can trace many trajectories, I chose to focus on the socialist history. Really, we don't have socialism anymore. So I'm talking the historical roots of feminism in socialist movements, because it was people like Mrs. Ransom-Kuti who were members of the International Democratic Federation. Early, the foremothers, if I were going into the colonial history, I would start naming the women who went to those international socialist and feminist meetings and went home and engaged politically and back and forth. And in the end, Mrs. Kuti and Dambo Sawaba these are both very strong Nigerian socialist feminists. The government prevented them from attending these meetings because of their subversiveness. So yes, I think that's been really important. In terms, I didn't talk about bourgeois feminism particularly, but there are definitely elite versions of feminism that are entirely compatible with capitalism in its current form. And you've heard of Sheryl Sandberg, the lean-in feminism espoused by multimillionaire women. And the work harder feminisms and let's get in feminisms, let's join them. So in Africa, I'd say the most liberal version is inclusionary feminism, which stops at getting a place at the table. And clearly it's not been working well enough. because those who get a place at the table have not generally been feminists, and if they are, they haven't lasted long at the table. There's plenty of examples of their removal from any position of influence for sticking to positions that are feminist. The anti-capitalism one, personally, I'm anti-capitalist, and I think the African independence generation, the radical thinkers, were all anti-capitalist because capitalism came to us through colonialism. How can you be a self-respecting anti-colonial and not be critical of capitalism? So I want to turn the question the other way. It hasn't worked for us. Look at the state of the continent. This is what capitalism has delivered to us. So we need to think again. And the current version of neoliberal capitalism that's concentrated on weakening the state is especially problematic. I mean, the left in Africa and feminists who've been challenging and critiquing the state since the day of independence. Well, maybe we gave a few days, but pretty soon after, within a decade at the most, are still there. I mean, there's no... The question is, how could you be feminist and be pro-capitalist if you come from a former colony? I don't know. It's not been possible for me. But there are lots of, as one of my colleagues, friends calls them, fellow travelers. People who present as feminists, because it has become, I mean, Beyonce, who doesn't want to be like Beyonce? Some of us don't, but, you know, so there's a star, a celebrity thing. So lots of people will say they're feminists and they may not know what they're saying, historically or intellectually or politically. So that's to do with proliferation of language, which, as we've seen, there's been a lot of, including socialist language, misapplied, misused by dictatorships.
There is one more question? Yeah, okay, you should go for it.
Thank you, Professor Mama, for your wonderful presentation. I think I studied with you about 20 years ago. And things still remain complicated, for which I really would like to thank you. I do have a question. I think it's from my own background in international relations, because you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk to say that you're not studying your own country as an epistemological issue. And I would like you to please expand on that a bit, because that's something that one very often has as an assumption that you're going to work on your own country because you're a native informant and you're much better at it, etc., etc. And your training or your skill set to look at other countries is completely dismissed. So it's a question of representation and authenticity in a certain way. And the other question that I had was the question of women's manifestos. At some stage, I wasn't quite sure which context you're actually speaking of. I actually had to turn around to my colleague and ask her, is she talking about South Africa now? Is this a women's charter? Is this, it seems to be a phenomenon that diffuses across the continent. And perhaps if you could give us a couple of distinctions around the strategy specifically. Just a couple of pointers about distinctions around the strategy. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, I do study my own country. I'm just not talking about it today. And frankly, I did go and spend a fair amount of time in Nigeria. I'm from the north, and as a woman from the north in such a diverse and big country, I want to work there. And it's quite difficult right now, and it's very hard to think about going and doing research when there are large internally displaced people's camps full of women. I couldn't bring myself I couldn't get there, and it required a lot more time and some activism. It's interesting, that's my context, and I found myself unable to, I need to spend more time, and it's huge, and so I did some research there, but decided I wasn't ready to. But it's in the background always. One's own places are always in one's epistemology somewhere. So Nigerian experience certainly informs my analysis of military rule, the concept state feminism, the appropriation by military regimes is something I was familiar with before Ghana. So there's cross-fertilization, but I want to come to this question of international studies, because, you know, the old paradigm, and I was subject to it as a student, was that natives cannot possibly study their own reality, or they'll be biased. Right? Remember that? Can you remember that? I mean, I certainly remember it. I never got any funding to ever do anything in my own country because there were experts already, and we couldn't possibly be as good as those lovely gentlemen from Oxford who were the experts. So the first order was to insist that Africans can research Africa competently. And that there's a long history of it. I mean, I can recall women who went home to do research like Sohir Morsi in the 1970s in Egypt. And so we've accumulated quite a tradition of insisting on researching our own context. And anyone who knows anything about politics, knowledge is power, and the movements won't get anywhere if we don't have an information basis. And indeed, I would say the first African feminist research was absolutely not carried out by academics. It's carried out by market traders, investigating markets and prices, for example. So, you know, one could run with what is research and what is research in Africa, and I think it's a really important conversation. So we've had to defend the right to study our societies. Can you imagine telling a German, you're not competent to study Germany, only go and study other places? Austria, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, so that's the north-south part, and then there's the Africa part, and I struggled with this a lot because there is an earlier article on is it ethical to study Africa, which I pose some of these questions and go into some of the details. So I have questioned myself a lot. First of all, because I moved to America, but then, you know, I did 10 years of little research in South Africa because I paralyzed myself and did service and writing about service instead. There were a lot of South Africans already trying to do it, so that was fine. I was happy to support. But I'm now on a second displacement, and am I going to never do, you know? So one is I'm very personally compelled to. It's my interest. It's for every reason I mentioned. So now the question of whether we're studying our own, yes, Nigeria is very big and diverse, but I also want to defend the right of Africans to look across borders because it's hugely productive. I mean, I learned that from the movement, actually, not as a researcher. Now, if the movement's working across borders and I'm researching the movements, you can see where my rationale begins to develop. I'm going to have to think it more and write it up more. And then how I address ethical questions generally is through designing a methodology. So the issue of academic tourism, as Chandra Mohanty names it in a 2013 article, the issue of non-accountability is a problem. You know, these fly-in, fly-out researchers don't have to do anything that matters to anybody local because their goal is publishing in some foreign languages at a remote location. Globalization has helped us call some of those to account, by the way, because we can access everything they've written too. So there is more accountability in the intellectual terrain because of the circulation of information being so much freer, which is great. So you can begin to have real conversations, although that's still difficult. So I adopted it as a pan-African feminist, and so I'm going to improvise this methodology, and how I'm going to do it is I'm so glad you asked about this, because it troubled me a lot. But to rely on my own, I've used a networking strategy that actually is rooted in my own connections. It's not an accident that I chose those 3 countries. As I said, they're the places I've had the longest ongoing contact and interaction with women's organizations outside of Nigeria. In fact, after our organization was burnt down in northern Nigeria, it moved to Accra. So I have a very serious reason, due to my own family's displacement, for focusing a lot of the work I do around Ghana. It's a neighboring country, and they accommodated us when the work staff had to flee, and we lost that office. So we moved the Bantu is a Pan-African network. We moved it to Accra. So I also have, so you can see it's a bit improvised, but the commitments, the ethical commitments, are to a really collaborative thing. And you'll notice I've mentioned only published names, because that will be negotiated at every step. I did over 100 in-depth interviews 1 to 4 hours long. I've had to personally transcribe and then personally send those transcripts to all the people I interviewed, inviting them to write their own biography and saying I'd be really supportive if they would, but in the meantime, will they approve this version of our conversation? And I've done all of that personally, but that's an ethical thing. It's huge work. It's taken rather too long. But so it's about collaboration. I haven't done a sample. I've contacted the best-known feminists who I have a personal relationship with and taken their guidance. You know, who should I talk to? So it's very collaborative, both in terms of the personnel involved, and in each place I've worked with local research assistant whose capacity need developing and wanted to work with me, and I've used whatever research, had some startup money. It's a very poorly funded research. So I've actually had to stay with many of my collaborators so that I can pay research assistants who are junior scholars instead. So it's a big question, and I'm working it out every day, and I'm kind of experimenting with what is it to try and do ethical research that doesn't exploit, that remunerates locally. And I can do this because I have a salary and a job, and I feel an obligation to give and take at the same time. But as I said, it's a joint project, and it's been the best project I've ever done in terms of people's cooperation. Feminists are amazing. They're literally lining up to be interviewed. This would not happen with most research projects, we all know. So I feel affirmed in what I'm trying to do by the reception. And nobody who doesn't want to talk to me has to, of course. And then I do a lot of media archiving. So I'm doing fact-checking. The archives, the organizational archives are disappointing, very problematic. But therefore collecting organizational histories. And so using multiple methods, not because I don't trust what people say, but because it's always good to have multiple angles on any particular thing. So I'm using life histories, organizational studies, which happens to be my background, as well as media profiling, and whatever organizational documents I can find. And that's where I'm saying our archives are in a terrible, tragically terrible state. Even where there were strong archives 10 years ago, and I won't name an organization, but I cried when I went there. I did a history with them 10 years ago, and it was a resource and archive center. They closed down the archive so they could rent the room to raise funds by hosting other people's meetings. I followed the archive. It's in boxes somewhere. So the question is, how do we salvage that? So I'm beginning to involve myself in more longer-term work around archiving and getting movements to archive, and that's a dream right now. But that's something concrete that I hope will come out in addition to whatever I write in collaboration with my colleagues, sisters. Does that help?
Okay.
I'll write it up so other people can try it.
And it makes somehow the perfect end of our discussion tonight, since it points towards your next lecture coming up on Wednesday, no? Doesn't it? Yeah, it does. It does, since epistemic and methodological questions we will be with, or you will be dealing with, and will be concerned with in the second lecture in the context of the Cornelia Goethe Center colloquium speech on Wednesday. So, hope to see many of you on Wednesday, and maybe as well on Thursday when we display the film. Helma is too fast, a little bit too fast, because I don't want to come to the full end before leaving at least 2 or 3 words of thanks to all the people and team members behind the stage, so to say, who have enabled your coming, the event and everything. My wonderful team, you already know most of them. Thank you so much for all your support. The whole CGC team, Barbara Korwolik, who had already to leave, Marianne, who was always available. Thank you so much. And last not least, this is my personal issue. It was such a pleasure in the course over the last 1.5 years to work so closely with Helma and Kira. Thank you so much for such a kind of feminist solidarity within the institution. And finally, thanks so much to Amina Mama.